The wind came at 20 below, cutting through the gaps in the depot walls like a knife looking for bone. Caleb Hardin heard it first, metal scraping on frozen rails, the sound wrong for this hour, wrong for this godforsaken stretch of track 12 miles south of anywhere that mattered. He'd been checking fence lines when the blizzard hit, and the old foreman's shack was the only shelter for 40 miles. The scraping stopped, then a sound like a child crying, but thinner, the way a thing cries when it's nearly done crying forever. He found her half buried in a snowdrift against the shack wall, a girl in a wheelchair, maybe 11, lips the color of a week-old bruise. Her fingers were locked around a tin of peaches, the label fancy, Sutton and Kobe Imports, Denver, and her eyes were open, but not seeing much. The wheelchair's wheels had carved 2 lines through the snow before she'd stopped moving. Caleb wrapped her in his coat, blankets, anything wool he could find that wasn't frozen solid. The smell of rust and old creosote clung to her, and something else, urine, fear, days of it. By the time he got her back to the ranch, dawn was breaking gray over the prairie. By the time Vernon Pritchard showed up on his porch with a deputy, the whole town already knew. "That girl's a thief," Pritchard said, his breath clouding white in the cold. He pointed at Nora, still wrapped in blankets by Caleb's fire. "Stole from my inventory at the depot. I want her arrested." Caleb stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. The deputy shifted his weight, looked anywhere but at Caleb's face. "She was dying," Caleb said. His voice came out low, flat. "I don't give a damn about your tin of peaches." Pritchard smiled, but it didn't reach past his teeth. "Law cares, Hardin. And you owe me $2,800, remember that." He turned, boots crunching on frozen mud. The deputy hesitated, opened his mouth, closed it. "He's got papers, Caleb," the deputy said finally. "Legal papers." 2 days passed before Nora spoke. Doc Brennan came out from town, his bag rattling with glass bottles, and examined her legs while she stared at the ceiling. "Polio," he said, 5, maybe 6 years back. The paralysis was permanent. "She'll need braces," Doc said quietly, washing his hands in the basin. $40 for a decent pair, maybe more. Caleb nodded. $40. He had 17 in a coffee tin above the stove. Doc dried his hands on a towel that had been Martha's once, white cotton gone gray from years of use. "Pritchard's been asking questions. About you, about her." He kept his voice low, though Nora was in the other room. "He wants something, Caleb. I've known that man 20 years. He doesn't chase after a tin of peaches this hard." The windmill outside creaked, metal on metal, the sound it made when the wind came from the north. Caleb had been meaning to fix it for 3 years. The wheel was cracked, but it still turned. Water still came up, cold and clean. "What kind of questions?" Caleb asked. "Legal ones. Guardianship. Who's responsible for her care?" Doc pulled on his coat, the wool heavy with the smell of horse and tobacco. "Said he'd pay me to testify you're unfit. $20. Caleb looked at him. "I told him no," Doc said. "But he'll find someone who won't." After Doc left, Caleb sat by the fire and looked at Nora sleeping in Martha's old chair, the one with the cushion worn down on one side. The girl's hair was dark, tangled, and someone, her mother, maybe, or someone who'd cared once, had braided it before all this started. The braid was coming undone now. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't asked for a child to show up, half frozen, on a night when any sane man would have stayed home. But here she was, breathing shallow, under 3 blankets, and here he was, a widower with a cracked windmill and a note coming due. Martha would have known what to do. Martha always knew. The fire popped, throwing sparks against the screen. In the morning he'd ride to town, talk to Pritchard. Maybe they could settle this quiet before it got worse. But when morning came, Pritchard was already waiting. The Red Bluff Bank sat on Main Street like a tooth in a sick mouth. White paint peeling, windows narrow, the kind of building that looked at you first. Caleb tied his horse to the rail outside, mud already starting to thaw in the weak February sun. Inside, the air smelled like ink and old paper and something else, something sour underneath. Vernon Pritchard sat behind his desk, 55 and soft in the middle, the kind of soft that came from years of sitting while other men worked. He looked up when Caleb entered, and his face arranged itself into something meant to be friendly. "Hardin, good, saves me a trip." He opened a drawer, pulled out a ledger, then a single sheet of paper. "We need to discuss your situation." Caleb stood, didn't sit. The deputy was there too, leaning against the wall near the door, hat in his hands. Pritchard laid the paper on the desk, turned it so Caleb could read. Numbers, dates. Interest compounded. $2,800, due April 1st. That's cattle auction day, Caleb said. I know. Pritchard folded his hands. His fingernails were clean, trimmed neat. You'll sell your herd, pay me, keep your ranch. That's how it's supposed to work. Then why are we talking? Pritchard's smile thinned. Because you're harboring a criminal, that little thief you brought in from the depot. She's 11 years old. Old enough to steal. Pritchard stood, walked to the window. Outside, 2 women passed, their voices muffled by glass. I've filed paperwork with the county. Emergency guardianship. The girl needs proper care, not a broke rancher playing father. Caleb's jaw tightened. She's got care. You can barely feed yourself. Pritchard turned, and now the smile was gone entirely. Here's what's going to happen. You sign over guardianship to the county. I'll make sure she's placed in a good home. Maybe the orphanage in Helena. They've got facilities for cripples. And I'll give you an extension on your note. 6 months. The room was too warm. A stove in the corner ticked, metal expanding. And if I don't? Pritchard sat back down, picked up a pen, tapped it twice on the desk. Then I call your note early. You've got 10 weeks, Hardin. Choose. Your land or that girl. The deputy looked at the floor. Caleb walked out without answering. Behind him, he heard Pritchard say something to the deputy, too low to catch, but the tone was satisfied. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the smell of manure and wet wood and coal smoke from the blacksmith's forge down the street. Caleb untied his horse, swung up, and rode home slow. When he got back, Nora was awake, sitting in her chair by the window. The peach tin sat on the table beside her, label facing out. Sutton and Coleman Imports, Denver. Caleb stared at it for a long moment, then looked away. He didn't know any Suttons. 3 weeks later, the gossip had teeth. Caleb walked into Ida Mae Foster's general store for flour and salt, and the 2 men at the counter stopped talking mid-sentence. One of them, Frank Hollister, who ran the feedlot, picked up his purchases and left without a word. The other, a rancher Caleb had helped pull a calf 2 springs back, just nodded and turned away. Ida Mae stood behind the counter, 52 and broad in the shoulders, her gray hair pulled back tight. She'd run this store since her husband died 5 years ago. Died in an accident, the town said, though there were some who whispered other things about Vernon Pritchard and debts unpaid. 20 pounds of flour, Caleb said, 10 of salt. She measured it out in silence, her hands quick and sure. When she wrapped the packages in brown paper, she leaned in close. They're saying you're keeping a thief under your roof. Pritchard's bought drinks at the saloon 3 nights running. Pays men to talk. Her voice was low, barely above the creak of the floorboards. You need credit, Caleb. I know your note's coming due. I'll pay cash. I'm offering anyway. She tied the string tight. Don't listen to fools. But Pritchard's got the whole saloon on his payroll now and half the men who owe him money. The door opened. 2 women came in, saw Caleb, and their conversation died like a candle in wind. They moved to the far side of the store, whispering. Caleb paid, took his supplies, and left. Outside, the February sun was weak, the kind of light that gave no warmth. Mud was starting to win against the ice, and the street was a mess of frozen ruts and standing water. He loaded the flour into his saddlebag, and that's when he saw the crowd, 20, maybe 30 people, gathered on the church steps. Sunday wasn't for 2 more days. Father Gibbons stood at the top of the steps, his black coat buttoned against the wind. Vernon Pritchard stood beside him, one hand on the railing, the other holding a sheaf of papers. Caleb's gut tightened. He walked toward them, leading his horse. The crowd parted, faces turning. Some looked away, others stared. Pritchard saw him coming and smiled. Hardin, good. The town should hear this. He raised his voice the way men do when they want to sound reasonable. I've filed with the territorial court, legal guardianship for the Sutton girl. She needs proper care, schooling, medical attention, a stable home. She's got a home, Caleb said. You're a widower with a failing ranch and a note you can't pay. Pritchard held up the papers, waved them slightly. I'm not here to punish you, Hardin. I'm here to do what's right for that child. The county orphanage in Helena is equipped for her condition. They've got doctors, teachers. She doesn't need an orphanage. She needs more than you can give. Pritchard's voice softened, playing to the crowd now. We all know you're a decent man, but decency doesn't pay for leg braces, doesn't put food on the table when the bank comes calling. Caleb stepped closer, the smell of wet wool and tobacco and Pritchard's pomade Something floral, too sweet for a man. What do you want from her? Pritchard blinked. Want? I want what's best for... You chased her down for a 15-cent tin of peaches, now you're filing court papers. What do you want? For just a moment, less than a breath, Pritchard's face went blank, not angry, not indignant, afraid. Then the mask came back, smooth as creek ice. Justice must be served, that's all. Father Gibbons cleared his throat. He was 45, lean, with the kind of face that had seen too much and said too little. Vernon, why are you so desperate to control this child? The question hung in the cold air. Pritchard turned to the priest, and his voice got sharp. I'm not desperate, Father. I'm following the law. A child was found stealing. A widower with no legal standing took her in. The county has a right, a duty, to intervene. She wasn't stealing, Caleb said. She was dying. The law doesn't see it that way. Then the law's a damn fool. The crowd murmured. A few nodded. Most stayed quiet, eyes down. Pritchard straightened, rolled the papers in his hand. You've got until March 15th to sign the guardianship transfer. If you don't, I'll petition the court to remove her by force. And your note? He smiled, thin and cold. I'll call it due early. 30 days, Hardin, not 10 weeks. He descended the steps, brushing past Caleb. The crowd began to break apart, voices rising now, some angry, some uncertain. Father Gibbons came down slowly, his hand on the rail. He's hiding something. I know. Be careful. The priest's voice was quiet. A desperate man is a dangerous one. And Vernon Pritchard is more desperate than he's letting on. Caleb rode home as the sun dropped low, the sky going purple at the edges. When he got to the ranch, Nora was in the barn, her wheelchair near the stall where the old mare stood. She'd wheeled herself out here alone, 50 feet, over frozen mud and wheel ruts. She was feeding the horse hay, one handful at a time, her face serious and focused. Caleb watched from the doorway, the smell of manure and dried grass and animal warmth. Need help? He asked. She shook her head, didn't look at him. Nora. She stopped. Her hands were small, red from cold. Whatever happens, he said, you're not going to any orphanage. She looked up then, her eyes dark and older than 11. He won't stop. I know. Why does he want me? Caleb didn't have an answer, not yet, but he was starting to understand that the question was the right one. The blacksmith's forge sat at the edge of town, smoke rising black against the gray March sky. Ezra Wells had been working iron here for 40 years, and the sound of his hammer, 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, was as much a part of Red Bluff as the church bell or the wind. Caleb found him shaping a horseshoe, the metal glowing orange in the dim light. The old man was 63, shoulders still broad, hands scarred white from burns that never quite healed. He looked up when Caleb entered, nodded once, and kept working. The heat from the forge was a living thing, and the smell of coal and hot metal filled the small space. Caleb waited. You didn't interrupt Ezra mid-strike. Finally, the blacksmith plunged the shoe into a bucket of water. Steam hissed up, and the sound echoed off the stone walls. Heard about the church steps, Ezra said. He set the shoe aside, wiped his hands on a rag that might have been white once. Pritchard's got a mouth on him. He's got more than that. He's got papers. Ezra walked to the back of the shop, rummaged through a pile of scrap metal, and pulled out 2 curved pieces of steel. He held them up to the light, squinting. These'll fit a wheelchair, he said. Wheel rims, steel instead of wood. Won't crack in the cold, won't splinter. He set them on the workbench. For the girl. Caleb stared. Ezra? You saved my horses in '79. Barn fire. Remember? The old man picked up his hammer, tested the weight of it in his palm. I owe you. Debt's paid now. I can't. You can. Ezra's voice was firm. And you will, because that girl needs better than what she's got, and you're fool enough to try giving it to her. Caleb looked at the steel rims, the curve of them, the work it would take to fit them proper. Pritchard came to you, didn't he? Ezra spat into the dirt floor. Offered me $50 to testify you're unfit. Told me I'd lose credit at his bank if I didn't. He picked up the rims again, ran a thumb along the edge. I told him where he could shove his $50 and his credit both. The hammer rang out again as Ezra returned to his work, shaping something new from a rod of iron. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes. The rhythm of it was steady, sure, the sound of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He's scared, Caleb said. I saw it on his face. Scared men are the worst kind. They'll burn the world down to hide what they did. Ezra plunged the iron into water again, steam rising. You watch yourself, Caleb, and you watch that girl. When Caleb got home, The sun was nearly down. He carried the steel rims into the barn, set them in the corner where Nora couldn't see yet, a surprise for later when he figured out how to fit them proper. Inside the house, lamplight spilled yellow through the window. He could see her silhouette, sitting at the table, bent over something. He pushed open the door, the smell of bread baking, Ida Mae must have sent some by, and coffee on the stove. Nora looked up. She'd been drawing on a scrap of paper, a pencil stub in her hand. When she saw him, she tried to cover it, but not fast enough. Caleb saw what it was, a train. Rails stretching to a horizon, smoke rising from a stack. "Used to watch them," she said quietly. "Before." He hung his coat on the peg by the door, poured himself coffee. The cup was chipped, one Martha had loved for reasons he never understood. Before what? Before Mama died. Before Uncle Vernon came. Caleb sat across from her. "Vernon's your uncle?" She nodded, still looking at the drawing. "Mama's brother. After the accident, after Papa." Her voice caught. She stopped, swallowed hard. "Uncle Vernon said he'd take care of us, me and Mama. But then Mama got sick, and when she died, he said I had to go away, to a place for kids like me. The orphanage. He said it was for my own good, that he couldn't keep me." She looked up, her eyes dark and too old. "But I heard him and his clerk talking about money, about Papa's estate and probate and how long it would take." Caleb set his cup down. "Your father's estate. Papa worked for the railroad, Northern Pacific. He died 2 years ago. Train accident." Her hand moved to her lap, and Caleb saw she was touching the wheelchair cushion, pressing down on a lump he'd noticed before. "Uncle Vernon said there wasn't any money left, that Papa spent it all." The coffee had gone cold in Caleb's mouth. He swallowed it anyway. "Why'd you run?" "He was going to send me away the next day. The asylum wagon was coming." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I took food from the depot storage and hid. I thought I could get to Denver, find Mama's sister, but the blizzard came, and I couldn't. "You made it far enough," Caleb said. She looked at him for a long moment, then so quiet he almost missed it. "Stay." "What?" "You asked if I needed help earlier, in the barn." She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I'm asking now. Stay. Don't let him take me." Outside, the windmill creaked in the growing dark. The sound of it was lonely, broken, but it kept turning. Caleb reached across the table. Her hand was small in his, cold and shaking. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. That night, after she'd gone to sleep, he sat by the fire and thought about what she'd told him. Estate, probate, money. Vernon Pritchard wasn't chasing a thief, he was chasing an inheritance. The second week of March brought rain mixed with sleet, the kind of weather that turned the roads to soup and made everything smell like rot and wet earth. Caleb was in the barn checking the cattle when he heard the horse coming fast. He stepped out into the gray light. A rider, the deputy, mud-splattered and breathing hard. Behind him, 2 more men Caleb didn't recognize. They wore suits under their coats, the kind men wore when they carried papers that could ruin you. "Caleb Hardin?" one of them said. "You know who I am." The man dismounted, pulled a document from inside his coat. "Territorial Land Office. We're here about water rights to the creek running through your property." Caleb's gut went cold. What about them? "They're contested. Vernon Pritchard, acting as executor of the Sutton estate, has filed a claim. Says the rights belong to the estate, not to you." The man held out the paper. "You've got 48 hours to vacate creek access or face contempt charges." The words didn't make sense at first. Then they did, all at once, like a fist to the chest. "The creek's been mine for 20 years. It was here when I bought the land. Previous owner sold water rights separate in 1879 to a Samuel Sutton. Sutton's estate now controls them." The man's voice was flat, bored. "Pritchard's the executor. He says you're in violation. Without water, 48 hours. They rode off, the deputy trailing behind. He didn't look back. Caleb stood in the mud, rain soaking through his shirt, the paper in his hand already starting to soften. Without creek water, the cattle would have to be moved or they'd die. And moving them this time of year, in this weather, meant losing half the herd. Maybe more. April 1st was 3 weeks away, auction day, the day his note came due. Pritchard wasn't just trying to take Nora, he was trying to take everything. Sunday came cold and clear. The whole town turned out for service, the way they always did. filling the pews and spilling onto the steps. Father Gibbons stood at the front, his voice carrying over the crowd, talking about mercy and judgment and the difference between the two. Caleb sat in the back with Nora beside him, her wheelchair parked at the end of the pew. People stared. Some whispered. A woman, 2 rows up, turned and looked at Nora like she was something broken that shouldn't be in a holy place. After the service, the crowd moved outside into the thin sunlight. That's when Pritchard appeared at the top of the steps, his coat pressed neat, his face arranged in that same false concern. "Brothers and sisters," he said, loud enough to carry, "a moment of your time." The crowd slowed, turned. Caleb felt Nora's hand tighten on his arm. Pritchard descended 2 steps, holding a piece of paper. "I've tried to handle this quietly, Christian charity and all, but Mr. Harden has refused every reasonable offer." He looked directly at Caleb now. "Your note, sir, $2,800, due April 1st. The crowd went quiet. "I know you're planning to sell your herd at auction to cover it. That's the way it should work." Pritchard's voice was smooth, reasonable. "But I've reconsidered the terms. I'm calling the note due today, 30 days from now, not April 1st. Someone gasped. Caleb heard Ida Mae's voice. "Vernon, you can't." "I can, and I am." Pritchard folded the paper, tucked it into his coat. "You've been harboring a fugitive, Harden, interfering with county guardianship proceedings, violating water rights. I've been patient, but patience has limits." Father Gibbons stepped forward. "This is a house of God, Vernon, not a courtroom." Then perhaps Mr. Harden should have remembered that before he chose lawlessness over decency. Caleb's hands curled into fists. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, the judgment, the fear. These people owed Pritchard money, or wanted to borrow it, or were scared of what he could do if they crossed him. He thought about Martha, about the day they'd buried her, the same crowd standing silent while Father Gibbons spoke words that meant nothing and everything. About the 4 years since, working alone, eating alone, talking to a gravestone because the living had stopped listening. He thought about Nora's hand on his arm, small and cold and trusting. And he thought about Vernon Pritchard's face on those church steps 3 weeks ago, that flash of fear when he'd been asked why he wanted control of a crippled girl so badly. Caleb stepped forward, reached into his coat, pulled out the folded paper, the note, the one he'd been carrying since the day he'd signed it, 3 years of sweat and work and trying to keep a ranch alive after his wife died. "You want this note?" he said. Pritchard smiled. "I want payment, but if you're offering—" Caleb tore it in half. The sound was sharp in the cold air, louder than it should have been. He tore it again and again until the pieces were small enough to scatter in the wind. They fell like snow, white against the muddy ground. The crowd stood frozen. Someone made a sound. Shock or approval, Caleb couldn't tell. Pritchard's face went white, not red with anger, white, the color of a man who'd just seen something that terrified him. "You just forfeited your ranch," Pritchard said, his voice shaking. "Foreclosure, 30 days. I'll take every acre, every head of cattle, every—" "Take it," Caleb said, "but you're not taking her." He turned, pushed Nora's wheelchair toward the street. The crowd parted, silent now, watching. Behind him, Pritchard's voice rose, high and sharp. "You're a fool, Harden. That land was worth 10 of her. You've thrown away everything for a crippled thief who isn't even yours." Caleb kept walking. Nora looked back once, her face pale, then forward again. They were halfway down Main Street when Ezra stepped out of the blacksmith's shop, hammer still in his hand. He nodded once. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. At the general store, Ida Mae stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You need anything, Caleb? You come ask. Credit's good as long as I'm breathing." Doc Brennan was outside his office, bag in hand, heading to a call. He tipped his hat. "You did right." Not everyone agreed. Caleb could see it in the face that turned away, the men who crossed the street to avoid him, the women who pulled their children closer. But some, enough, held his gaze and nodded. When they got back to the ranch, Nora finally spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." Caleb unhitched his horse, led it to the barn, the smell of hay and manure and animal warmth. "Had to. Now you'll lose everything. Some things are worth losing everything for." He turned, looked at her. "Your uncle's not after you because you stole a tin of peaches, Nora. He's after something else. Something bigger." She didn't answer, just wheeled herself into the house. That night, Caleb sat by the fire and thought about the look on Pritchard's face. That fear, that desperation. A man didn't tear up $2,800 over pride. He did it over principle. or over the terrible certainty that if he didn't, he'd never be able to look at himself again. Martha's photograph sat on the mantel, her smile frozen in time. He'd talked to her less in the past few weeks, hadn't needed to somehow. The choices were clearer now, even if the consequences weren't. Outside, the windmill creaked in the dark. Still broken, still turning. 3 weeks until foreclosure. 3 weeks to figure out what Vernon Pritchard was really hiding. 3 weeks to keep a promise to an 11-year-old girl who'd wheeled herself through a blizzard because dying in the snow was better than where her uncle wanted to send her. Caleb banked the fire, checked the doors, and went to bed. He didn't sleep much, but when he did, he didn't dream of losing the ranch. He dreamed of Martha smiling at him the way she used to when he'd done something brave and foolish, and her voice saying what she'd always said, "You'll figure it out, Caleb Hardin, you always do." The next morning, Ida Mae came to the ranch herself. She drove her wagon up the muddy track, a wooden crate rattling in the back, and when Caleb came out to meet her, she was already climbing down. "Got something for you," she said, not waiting for a greeting. She pulled a ledger from under her coat, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry. "Carbon copies. Every transaction in my store for the past 3 years." Caleb took it, felt the weight of it. "Why?" "Because Vernon Pritchard filed a report saying Nora stole goods from my inventory, dated it back to January when you found her." Ida Mae's jaw was set, her eyes hard. "I keep carbons of everything, every sale, every credit line, every piece that goes missing. It's how I knew my husband didn't die in an accident. Someone had been stealing from us for months, and the ledger proved it." She opened the book, flipped to January. Her finger traced down the columns, dates, items, amounts, all in her neat, precise hand. No missing inventory, not a single tin of peaches, not anything. She looked up. "Vernon altered the report, forged my signature. I've got the original carbon that proves it." The smell of the paper was old, familiar, ink and dust and the faint scent of the general store's wood shelves. Caleb turned the pages carefully. Everything accounted for, everything documented. "He'll burn your store if he knows you have this," Caleb said. "Let him try." Her voice was steel wrapped in cotton. "A child's life is worth more than lumber and nails. Always has been." She climbed back onto the wagon, took up the reins. "You need anything? You come ask." "And Caleb?" She looked down at him, the morning light catching the gray in her hair. "You keep that book safe. It's the only proof we've got that Vernon Pritchard is a liar." She drove off, the wagon creaking, wheels cutting deep ruts in the mud. Caleb took the ledger inside, wrapped it in more oilcloth, and hid it under a loose floorboard in the back room. Martha had shown him that hiding spot years ago, said every house needed a place for things that mattered. When he came back out, Nora was at the window, watching the road. "Was that the store lady?" she asked. "Ida Mae. She brought evidence." Nora turned her chair slightly. "Evidence of what?" "That your uncle's been lying, about the theft, maybe about other things too." She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the wheelchair's arms. Then, "There's something I need to show you." She wheeled herself to her chair by the fire, the one she slept in at night because Caleb's bed was too high for her to manage alone. She reached down to the cushion, the one with the lump he'd noticed, the one she wouldn't let him fix. Her fingers worked at the seam, and she pulled out something wrapped in a piece of old silk. "Papa gave this to me," she said. "Before the accident. He said to hide it where Uncle Vernon couldn't find it." She unwrapped the silk carefully. Inside was a brass compass, the kind railroad men carried, but this one was engraved, the letters worn but still readable. "To Nora, find your way home." Papa, Caleb, took it, felt the weight of it in his palm. The brass was warm from being hidden against her body for so long. The needle still moved, still pointed north. "Why would your father tell you to hide this from Vernon?" "I don't know. But Papa didn't trust him, not after Mama married him." She stopped, corrected herself. "Not married. Uncle Vernon's Mama's brother. But he always acted like he owned us, like we were his property." "What else did your father say?" "That if anything happened to him, I should go to his lawyer in Denver, Mr. Whitmore. He said Mr. Whitmore had papers that would keep me safe." Her voice dropped. "But then the train accident happened, and Mama got sick, and Uncle Vernon said all of Papa's money was gone, that there was nothing left." Caleb turned the compass over. On the back, more engraving, smaller, harder to read. SS Northern Pacific Rail Co. Your father worked for the railroad, Caleb said slowly. Samuel Sutton. Nora nodded. He was a supervisor. Then he became something else, something with more money. He bought Mama a house in Denver, bought me my wheelchair when the polio came. He said we'd never want for anything. Samuel Sutton, the name on the peach tin label, Sutton and Cumberland Imports, and Vernon Pritchard, claiming water rights through the Sutton estate. Caleb stood, walked to the window. The sky was clearing, patches of blue showing through the gray, the smell of wet earth and pine from the trees at the edge of his property. Your father's estate, he said. Pritchard's the executor. He said he was, said it was his duty as Mama's brother. And if you went to the orphanage, if you disappeared into the territorial system, he'd control that estate until you turned 18, maybe longer. Nora's face was pale. How much was it worth? Enough that he'd chase you through a blizzard. Enough that he'd forge documents and call in debts and threaten foreclosure. Caleb turned back to her. Enough to kill for, maybe. The compass sat on the table between them, brass glinting in the weak sunlight. Outside, the sound of horses, multiple riders. Caleb moved to the door, opened it. Father Gibbons sat on a chestnut mare, his black coat dusty from the road. Behind him, Doc Brennan on his old gray gelding. And behind them both, Ezra Wells riding a horse too small for his frame, his blacksmith's hammer hanging from his saddle. Figured you might need some company, Father Gibbons said, words spreading that Pritchard's planning something, thought we'd best be here when it happens. Doc dismounted, his joints creaking. Also, that girl needs a proper examination. Those legs need checking, and I've got braces ordered. Should be here by week's end. Ezra stayed mounted, his eyes scanning the road. And I brought those wheel rims. Figure we can fit them this afternoon. Caleb looked at the three of them, priest, doctor, blacksmith, men with no reason to risk Pritchard's anger except that it was the right thing to do. Come on in, he said. Coffee's hot. As they entered, Nora looked up at them with something like wonder, like she'd forgotten what it felt like when people chose to stand beside you instead of walking away. Father Gibbons smiled at her, gentle. Hello, child. I'm told you need baptizing proper, not the emergency kind, but the real thing. Creek's thawed enough now, if you're willing. She looked at Caleb. He nodded. I'm willing, she said. The baptism happened on a Sunday afternoon, the creek running clear and cold, the ice finally gone except for a few stubborn patches in the shade. Father Gibbons stood ankle-deep in the water, his boots dark and soaked, while Nora sat at the edge in her wheelchair, Caleb beside her. 30 people came. Not the whole town, but enough. Ezra and Doc, Ida Mae with 2 other women from church, a handful of ranchers and their families. People who decided that standing with Caleb meant something more than staying safe. Father Gibbons spoke the old words, simple and sure, and when he scooped water in his hands and poured it over Nora's head, she closed her eyes and didn't flinch from the cold. I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The water ran down her face, and when she opened her eyes, they were bright with something Caleb couldn't name. Not quite joy, not quite peace, but something close to both. After, Ida Mae wrapped Nora in a blanket and the women fussed over her hair while the men stood in clusters talking low. Caleb caught fragments. Pritchard's name, the foreclosure, rumors about the bank's records. Father Gibbons pulled Caleb aside, his voice barely above a whisper. There's something you should know. I heard it in the confession, so I can't say who, but... He paused, choosing words carefully. Vernon's been visiting the county seat, filing more papers, and his wife's been seen with bruises. Caleb's jaw tightened. He beats her? She won't say, but I've offered sanctuary if she needs it. The priest looked back at Nora, surrounded by women who were braiding her wet hair. Your earthly father may yet walk among us, I told her. Keep faith. What does that mean? Father Gibbons smiled, sad and knowing. Sometimes God works in strange ways. And sometimes men who are lost find their way home when they're needed most. Before Caleb could ask more, hoofbeats sounded on the road. 3 riders moving fast. The crowd went quiet. The riders weren't from town. They were harder men, the kind hired for work that needed doing but didn't stand scrutiny. They reined up at the edge of the property, eyes scanning the group. The lead rider, scarred face, gun visible on his hip, called out, "Which one's Hardin?" Caleb stepped forward. "That's me." "Message from Mr. Pritchard. You got 3 weeks left before foreclosure. He's offering one last chance. Sign over the girl, he'll forgive the debt and give you your ranch back. Tell him no. The writer spat into the dirt. He said you'd say that. Also said to tell you, accidents happen, especially to old ranches, especially to barns full of hay. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Ezra moved up beside Caleb, his hammer suddenly in his hand. You boys best ride on. The writer grinned. Just delivering a message, old man. They turned and rode off, kicking up mud. Doc came over, his face grim. They mean it. Vernon's hiring muscle now. Let him, Caleb said, but his gut was cold. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the barn with his rifle across his knees, listening to every sound, the horses shifting, the wind, the creak of old wood, the smell of hay and leather and oil from the gun. Around midnight, he heard it. Footsteps, careful and quiet. He stood, moving to the door, rifle ready. A figure appeared in the moonlight, small, hunched against the cold. A woman. She saw him, froze. Please, don't shoot. Caleb lowered the rifle. Who are you? She stepped closer and he saw her face in the pale light. Bruises, fresh and dark, around one eye. Her lip split. She was maybe 40, worn thin by years of something Caleb recognized as fear. I'm Clara Pritchard. Her voice shook. I need to talk to you about my husband. Inside the house, Caleb lit a lamp while Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking. Nora had woken, wheeled herself out, and now sat silent, watching. He'll kill me if he knows I'm here, Clara said finally. But I can't. I can't let him do this anymore. Do what? Caleb asked. Steal, lie, hurt people. She looked up, her good eye wet with tears. He's been embezzling from the bank, from estate accounts, for 2 years, maybe longer. The Sutton estate? She nodded. Samuel Sutton had money, a lot of it, railroad stock, cash reserves, property in Denver. When he died, Vernon was named executor, he's family, and the court trusted him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He's taken $18,000, maybe more, and if anyone audits the accounts, if anyone looks close, he goes to prison, Caleb finished. He's desperate. He needs Nora in the orphanage so he can keep control of the estate until she's 18. By then, there won't be anything left to inherit. Clara's hands shook. I tried to stop him, tried to make him see reason. That's when... She touched her bruised face. That's when he started hitting me. Nora made a small sound. Clara looked at her, and something broke in the woman's face. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. I'm so sorry. I knew what he was doing, and I didn't stop him. I was scared. I still am. Why come now? Caleb asked. Because yesterday, a letter came. From Denver. From a lawyer named Whitmore. She pulled an envelope from her coat, set it on the table. Vernon burned it, but I saw the name first, and I remembered. Samuel Sutton had a lawyer named Whitmore. Caleb picked up the envelope. It was charred at the edges, but the return address was still visible. Arthur Whitmore, Esquino Railroad Commerce Law, Denver, Colorado Territory. What did it say? Nora asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know. Vernon burned it before I could read it. Clara stood, her chair scraping. But Mr. Whitmore's still in Denver, and if Samuel Sutton trusted him, maybe he can help. She moved to the door, then stopped. There's one more thing. The county clerk, Eugene Morris, he quit last month, moved to Denver. Vernon forced him to forge documents, the theft report, guardianship papers, maybe more. Eugene knows everything. Where in Denver? Caleb asked. I don't know, but he's scared of Vernon. If you can find him, if you can get him to testify. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in. I have to go, before he notices I'm gone. Wait, Nora said. Why help us? Clara looked back, tears on her face now. Because I had a daughter once. She died of fever when she was 10, and if someone had stood up for her the way Mr. Hardin's standing up for you, her voice broke, maybe she'd still be alive. She slipped out into the night. Caleb locked the door behind her, checked the windows, then sat back down at the table. The envelope sat between them, scorched and fragile. A lawyer in Denver, a clerk who knew the truth, and 3 weeks until Vernon Pritchard took everything. We need help, Nora said quietly. I know. Real help, not just people in town. We need someone who can fight him with the law. Caleb looked at the compass still sitting on the table, the one that said, "Find your way home." "Then we find Whitmore," he said. "And we find Eugene Morris." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. The next 2 weeks passed like water through cupped hands, too fast, impossible to hold. Caleb worked the ranch alone most days, Ezra and Doc checking in when they could. The hired men Pritchard had sent never came back, but Caleb slept in the barn anyway, rifle close, waiting for fire that never came. Maybe Pritchard was waiting, maybe Clara had bought them time, or maybe the banker had something worse planned. It was late April when the breaking point came. Not with fire or hired guns, but with Caleb alone at Martha's grave, the sun going down and the wind picking up cold. He'd ridden out after supper, left Nora with Doc at the house, said he needed to check fence lines, but his horse had carried him here instead, to the small plot on the hillside where Martha lay under 6 feet of Montana earth. The headstone was simple, just her name, her dates, and a line he'd chosen because he couldn't think of anything better. Beloved wife and mother. Mother to a child who'd never drawn breath, wife to a man who hadn't been able to save her. Caleb sat on the ground, his back against the stone, and let the exhaustion take him. "I tore up the note," he said to the quiet. "Threw away everything we built, for a girl who isn't even ours." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. "Pritchard's going to take the ranch. 3 weeks, maybe less." His voice cracked. "And I don't know if I did right, Martha. I don't know if I'm trying to save her, or just trying to fill the hole you left." No answer, just wind and the far-off cry of a hawk. "She calls me sir, not pa, not even Caleb, just sir, like I'm some stranger doing her a favor." He closed his eyes. "Maybe I am. Maybe that's all this is, an old widower playing at something he's got no right to." His hand found the grass beside the stone, pulled a few blades loose. "You'd know what to do, you always did, but you're not here, and I'm—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm scared, Martha. Scared I'm going to lose everything and it won't matter. Scared she'll end up in that orphanage anyway, and I'll have thrown it all away for nothing." The sun touched the horizon, turning the sky orange and gold. "Tell me I did right," he whispered. "Please." But the dead don't answer. They just lie there, silent and patient, while the living work out their own salvation. Caleb sat until full dark, then rode home. When he got back, Doc's horse was still tied outside. Through the window, he could see lamplight, hear voices. He went in. Doc and Nora were at the table, something spread between them. Maps, maybe, or papers, legal papers. Doc looked up. "You need to see this." Caleb hung his hat, moved closer. The papers were old, stained with mud along one edge, the ink faded but readable. "Found them in the creek," Doc said. "Spring runoffs washing up debris from the old train wreck. Been doing it for days. Metal, wood, personal effects." He tapped the papers. "These were caught in the rocks near the bend." Caleb picked one up. It was a contract, Northern Pacific Railroad, dated 2 years back, and at the bottom, a signature, Samuel Sutton, Regional Supervisor. "There's more," Nora said quietly. She pushed another paper forward. This one was different. Stock certificates. 10 of them, each for 1,000 shares. Northern Pacific Rail Company, issued to Samuel Sutton. 10,000 shares total. Caleb did the math in his head. Railroad stock was selling at $25 a share last he'd heard. Maybe more now. $250,000. He set the paper down carefully, like it might catch fire. "This was in the creek?" "Wrapped in oilcloth," Doc said. "Same kind surveyors use to protect documents in the field. Someone went to trouble to keep these safe." Nora's face was pale. "Papa always carried important papers with him, said he didn't trust banks." She looked at Caleb. "He must have had these on the train, when the accident happened." "Why would they end up in the creek 2 years later?" "Train went off the tracks near the depot," Doc said. "Bodies and wreckage scattered for a quarter mile. Spring floods move things. Could be these got caught in debris, buried in mud, and the thaw just now brought them up." Caleb turned the stock certificates over. On the back of each one, a stamp, for transfer to Nora Elizabeth Sutton upon father's death or incapacitation. "He left it all to you," Caleb said. Nora's hands were shaking. "Uncle Vernon said there was nothing, that Papa spent it all." "Vernon lied," Doc said. "And if these certificates exist, if they're valid—" "They are," a voice said from the doorway. Caleb spun. His hand went to where a gun would be, but he'd left the rifle in the barn. A man stood in the doorway. 45, maybe older, dressed in a mud-splattered suit, his face gaunt and scarred on one side. He held up empty hands. "Don't shoot, I'm not armed." His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it properly in a long time. "My name is Samuel Sutton, and I'm looking for my daughter." The room went silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Nora stared at the man, her face white as snow. "Papa?" The word came out broken, disbelieving. Samuel Sutton's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry I'm late." Then Nora was sobbing, and the man was crossing the room, dropping to his knees in front of her wheelchair, and she was reaching for him with shaking hands. Caleb stepped back, his heart hammering. The dead don't answer prayers, but sometimes the lost come home. Outside, thunder rumbled. The first drops of rain hit the roof, and somewhere in town, Vernon Pritchard was about to discover that his worst nightmare had just walked back into Montana territory. Alive. Samuel Sutton sat at Caleb's table, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and told them what had happened: the train accident, the derailment near the depot, 12 men dead, 3 missing. He'd been thrown clear, landed in the creek, hit his head on rocks. A trapper found him 2 days later, unconscious, half drowned, no identification. Took me to a charity hospital in Denver. I was there for 8 months, didn't know my name, where I was from, nothing. His hand went to the scar on his temple, a thick line of twisted skin. When the memories started coming back, it was in pieces: a girl's face, a train, numbers that might have been accounts or addresses. He'd spent another year searching, following fragments: a lawyer's name, Whitmore; a company, Northern Pacific; a town in Montana territory where he thought he'd lived. I wrote letters, sent telegrams, but Vernon had already filed death certificates, closed my accounts, told everyone I was gone. Samuel's voice went hard. He moved fast, like he'd been waiting for the chance. "He was stealing from you," Caleb said. "I know. Whitmore sent word last month. Someone was draining the estate accounts. That's when I knew I had to come back, memory or not." Samuel looked at Nora, his eyes wet. "I couldn't remember your face, sweetheart, but I remembered your name, and I remembered I had to find you." Nora hadn't let go of his hand since he'd arrived. "Mama?" Samuel's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. Whitmore told me last winter, fever. Uncle Vernon said you spent all the money, that there was nothing left." "I never spent a dime I didn't earn. Everything I had, I was saving for you and your mother." He reached into his coat, pulled out a brass compass identical to the one Nora had hidden in her wheelchair. "I had 2 of these made, one for me, one for you, so we'd always find our way back to each other." Nora pulled out her compass, set it on the table next to his. The engravings matched perfectly. Doc cleared his throat. "Mr. Sutton, you need to know, Vernon's filed for guardianship. He's been trying to send Nora to an orphanage, and he's called Caleb's ranch note due. Foreclosure in less than 2 weeks." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Where is he now?" "Town, most likely. The bank." Caleb stood. "But if you ride in there alone—" "I'm not riding in alone." Samuel looked at him. "You stood up for my daughter when no one else would. Tore up your own debt to protect her. I don't forget things like that, Mr. Hardin." "Call me Caleb." "Caleb, then." Samuel stood, extended his hand. "Thank you for keeping her safe, for giving her a home when I couldn't." Caleb shook it. The man's grip was strong, despite everything he'd been through. "What do you need?" Caleb asked. "Witnesses, documents, and a way to make Vernon confess in front of people who matter." Samuel's eyes were hard now, the softness gone. "I've been thinking about this for 200 miles, and I have a plan." Spring branding was set for Saturday, May 3rd. Every rancher in the county brought their cattle in, and the work became a festival. Fires burning, irons heating, families gathering to share food and stories while the men worked. This year, Caleb's branding was the last of the season. Word had spread fast. The widower who'd torn up his debt, the railroad man who'd come back from the dead, and the banker who'd lied about it all. By noon, 80 people had gathered at Caleb's ranch, more than had come to church in months. They filled the yard, the fence lines, spilled into the pasture where the branding fire crackled and smoked. Ezra had set up his portable forge, the anvil ringing as he worked. Ida Mae brought tables of food, bread, dried fruit, smoked meat. Father Gibbons moved through the crowd, speaking quiet words of encouragement, and Vernon Pritchard arrived with 2 deputies and a face like a thunderstorm. He dismounted near the fire, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Caleb. "This is a foreclosure notice. You were given 30 days. Today's the 28th. I'm here to ensure—" Ensure what, Vernon? Samuel Sutton stepped out from the crowd, still wearing his mud-stained suit, the scar on his temple visible in the sunlight. Pritchard went white, actually white, like he'd seen a ghost. You're not. He couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel Sutton, I believe you've been managing my estate. Samuel's voice carried across the yard. Without my permission, for 2 years. The crowd pressed closer. The deputies looked at each other, uncertain. Pritchard recovered fast, his face rearranging itself. Samuel, my God, we thought you were dead. The train accident. I'm aware. I was there. This is wonderful news. Nora will be so relieved. Nora's right here, Samuel said, and she's told me everything. Nora wheeled forward, Caleb beside her. She looked small next to the crowd, but her voice was steady. You said Papa spent all the money. You said there was nothing left. There wasn't. The estate was bankrupt when I took over. Liar. Ida May stepped forward, her ledger in her hands. You filed a theft report against this child, forged my signature, said she stole from my store. She opened the book, showed the pages to the crowd. Carbon copies prove she never took a thing. Pritchard's face darkened. A bookkeeping error? And the guardianship papers? Father Gibbons moved closer. The ones you filed claiming Caleb was unfit? Eugene Morris says you forced him to forge those too. Eugene's a drunk and a liar. Eugene's in Denver, a new voice called out, and he's written everything down. A man pushed through the crowd, travel-worn, nervous, but determined. Eugene Morris, the former county clerk, he held up a stack of papers. I've got copies of every document Vernon made me falsify. Theft reports, guardianship claims, estate transfers. His voice shook but didn't break. He threatened my family, said he'd ruin us if I didn't cooperate, so I ran. But I'm not running anymore. The deputies moved closer to Pritchard now, their hands near their guns, but not drawing. This is a conspiracy, Pritchard said, his voice rising. You're all working together to what? Samuel pulled out the stock certificates, held them up. To reclaim what's mine? These are 10,000 shares of Northern Pacific Rail, worth $250,000. I left them to my daughter, and you've been stealing from her inheritance for 2 years. Pritchard lunged, not at Samuel, but at the certificates. Ezra stepped in front of him, hammer raised. Far enough. The banker stopped, breathing hard. His eyes darted, looking for escape, finding none. The crowd had closed in, a wall of witnesses. You needed her gone, Caleb said quietly. If she disappeared into the territorial system, you could keep draining the estate for years, maybe forever. Pritchard stopped himself, but too late. Needed what? Samuel's voice was cold now. Money? To cover your gambling debts? Your embezzlement from others' accounts? Clara Pritchard stepped forward then, her face still bruised. He's stolen from half the estates in the county, not just yours. He thought if he controlled enough accounts, no one would notice the missing money until he could cover it back. Clara, shut your mouth. No. Her voice broke, but she kept talking. I'm done being quiet. I'm done pretending you're a decent man. You beat me. You stole from children. You tried to destroy a good man's life to hide what you'd done. The deputies moved then, one on each side of Pritchard. Vernon Pritchard, the older deputy said, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and falsifying legal documents. Territorial marshal's been notified. You'll be held until trial. Pritchard didn't fight. He just stood there, his face collapsing inward like a barn in a windstorm. As they led him away, he looked back once at Nora, not with hate, with something worse, desperation. I needed the money, he said, his voice raw. Denver debts, card games. I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to. You weren't, Samuel said. Men like you never do. They took him away. The crowd stood silent for a long moment. Then someone, one of the ranchers, started clapping. Others joined, then more, until the whole yard was filled with the sound of hands meeting, hard and sharp and final. Justice, frontier style. Not pretty, but done. Father Gibbons raised his voice over the noise. Brothers and sisters, we've witnessed something rare today. Truth standing up against power, and truth winning. Samuel turned to Caleb. I need to discuss something with you, about Nora. Caleb's stomach dropped, of course. Samuel was her father. He'd take her to Denver, give her the life she deserved. Schools, doctors, everything Caleb couldn't provide. I understand, Caleb said. She's yours. She is, But she's also yours, in a way that matters. Samuel's hand went to Nora's shoulder. You saved her life, gave her a home, stood up against a powerful man when it would have been easier to walk away. Any decent man would have... No, they wouldn't have. We both know that. Samuel looked around at the ranch, the old house, the cracked windmill, the barn that had seen better years. She needs both of us, I think. Her blood father and the man who fought for her when I couldn't. Nora was looking between them, her eyes wide. What are you saying? Caleb asked. I'm saying she spends summers here, learns ranching, riding, the kind of life I wanted her to have before everything went wrong, and winters in Denver, school, medical care, society. Samuel smiled. 2 fathers, 2 homes, if you're willing. Caleb looked at Nora. What do you want? She wheeled forward, took both their hands. I want both of you. Is that allowed? Caleb's throat was tight. Yeah, sweetheart. That's allowed. The branding continued into evening, the smell of smoke and beef and spring grass filling the air. Ezra fitted the steel wheel rims onto Nora's chair while she watched, delighted. Ida Mae served food until the tables were empty. Father Gibbons blessed the cattle and the land and the strange family that had formed from grief and courage and desperate need. And when the sun finally set, painting the sky orange and gold, Caleb stood beside Samuel and watched Nora laugh with the other children, her new wheels turning smooth and quiet on the dirt. Thank you, Samuel said quietly, for being there when I couldn't. She saved me too, Caleb replied. I just didn't know it at first. Martha's grave was visible on the hillside, the white cross catching the last light. Caleb thought about what he'd said there, about filling holes and doing right. Maybe he'd never know for certain if his choices were perfect, but watching Nora smile, hearing her laugh, seeing her belong, that felt like answer enough. The territorial marshal came 3 days later with a full audit team. They spent a week in Pritchard's bank, going through ledgers, interviewing witnesses, counting money that wasn't there, $18,000 from the Sutton estate, another 12 from 3 other accounts, widows, orphans, people who couldn't fight back. Vernon Pritchard had been stealing for 5 years, moving money between accounts like a shell game, always one step ahead of anyone who asked questions, until Samuel Sutton came back from the dead. The trial was set for Helena in July. Claire Pritchard filed for divorce the same week, took her children to her sister's ranch in Oregon, and never looked back. Eugene Morris testified before the grand jury, then disappeared into Denver with enough money from Samuel to start over somewhere. Nobody knew his name. And Caleb's ranch note? Forgiven. Paid in full by an anonymous benefactor who Ezra later admitted was Samuel Sutton, though the railroad man never said a word about it. A man saves your daughter's life, Ezra said, grinning around his pipe. You don't let him lose his home over it. That's just common sense. By mid-May, the grass was green and thick, wildflowers blooming purple and orange across the hills. The windmill had been repaired. Samuel hired an engineer from Denver who fixed the cracked wheel and oiled every bearing until it turned smooth and quiet. Water flowed clean and cold, and the cattle grew fat on spring pasture. Nora spent her days learning to ride. Ezra built a special saddle that supported her, straps holding her secure while a gentle mare named Molly carried her around the pasture. She couldn't use her legs, but her hands were strong, and she learned to guide the horse with reins and voice. Look, Papa, she called one afternoon, circling the corral. I'm riding. Samuel stood beside Caleb at the fence, both of them watching. Which Papa? Samuel asked, smiling. Both, Nora laughed. I've got 2 now. Doc came by weekly to check her progress, adjusting the new leg braces, teaching her exercises to keep her upper body strong. She'll never walk, he said one day, quiet so she wouldn't hear, but she'll have a good life anyway, better than most. She already does, Caleb said. Father Gibbons performed a ceremony in late May, not a baptism this time, but a blessing. He stood in Caleb's yard with the whole community watching and spoke words over Nora about family and belonging and how blood wasn't always thicker than choice. This child has 2 fathers now, he said, one who gave her life, one who gave her shelter when life tried to take it away. That's not confusion, that's abundance. The crowd, smaller than the branding, but no less important, nodded and prayed and ate Ida Mae's cooking until the sun went down. In June, Samuel took Nora to Denver for 2 weeks. He showed her the house he'd bought for her mother, introduced her to Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer who'd been searching for Samuel since the accident. They visited the school where she'd spend her winters, a place that specialized in teaching children with disabilities, where wheelchairs were common and nobody stared. When they came back, Nora was quieter, but happier, like something inside her had settled. "It's nice," she told Caleb that first night, sitting by the fire. "The school, the city, but I missed the windmill, and the horses, and you." "I missed you too," Caleb said. "Papa Samuel says I can bring friends here in the summer. From the school, kids like me." She looked up, uncertain. "Is that all right?" "More than all right. We'll teach them to ride. Fish the creek? Maybe even rope fence posts if they're brave enough." She smiled. "I told them about you, about how you tore up the banknote. They said you must be crazy." "Probably am. I said you were the bravest man I ever met, except for Papa Samuel. You're both the bravest." That night, after Nora was asleep, Caleb walked up to Martha's grave one last time. The summer stars were out, thick and bright, and the smell of sage and warm earth filled the air. "I did right," he said to the stone. "Wasn't sure before, but I am now." The wind moved through the grass, gentle this time, carrying no answer because none was needed. He'd spent 4 years talking to a gravestone, asking questions that had no answers, but now he had a daughter who called him brave, a friend who'd walked back from death, and a community that had learned the difference between law and justice. That was answer enough. When he got back to the house, lamplight spilled warm through the windows. Inside, he could hear Nora humming, something soft and tuneless, the sound of a child who felt safe enough to make noise. Caleb stopped on the porch, looked out at his land. The windmill turned smooth against the stars. The cattle were quiet in the pasture. The barn stood solid, hay stacked high for winter. Everything he'd almost lost, everything worth losing for. He went inside, checked the fire, locked the doors, and sat in his chair. On the table beside him, 2 brass compasses sat side by side, one Nora's, one Samuel's, both pointing north, both engraved with the same promise: find your way home. They had, all of them. Years later, when folks asked Caleb Hardin if he regretted tearing up that note, he'd lean back in his chair, the same one Martha used to sit in, worn smooth now by time and use, and tell them the truth. "A man's got to decide what he can live without. Turns out I could live without land. Couldn't live knowing I'd traded a child for dirt." Vernon Pritchard got 7 years in territorial prison, died in his 4th year. Pneumonia, they said, though some whispered it was shame that killed him first. The ranch prospered. Samuel's money helped, but it was Caleb's hands that kept it running. Early mornings, late nights, the kind of work that doesn't show in ledgers but builds something that lasts. Nora grew, spent summers on the ranch learning to rope and ride and shoot, winters in Denver studying law and literature and how to argue a case that judges couldn't ignore. By 17, she was rolling through university halls, writing papers about territorial reform and disability rights, making noise that echoed all the way to the Capitol. "Gonna make sure no banker ever does to another kid what Pritchard tried with me," she told Caleb once. She did, became a lawyer, then a territorial advocate, then something bigger, a voice that couldn't be silenced just because it came from a wheelchair. The last time Caleb saw her before his own death at 73, she brought her children to the ranch. 2 of them, both adopted, one with twisted legs, one deaf from birth. "Teaching them what you taught me," she said. "That family's who you'd tear up the deed for." The windmill still turned above them, steady and sure, and on the hillside 2 graves sat side by side now, Martha's and Caleb's, with a single line carved on his stone. "He chose mercy when the world chose ledgers. Some debts you pay with money, some you pay by showing up when the blizzard hits, and some, the ones that matter, you pay by being the kind of man who knows the difference between what's legal and what's right. Reckon that's what home is, not the land you own, but the people you'd tear up the deed for."